Hello my dears, and welcome back to Strange Playgrounds, episode something. I'm not sure, once again, depends on in what order these things go out. I actually have an episode which is currently editing, which should be very interesting. It's a discussion between myself and Rowan Fortunewood concerning everything from utopian fiction to politics to horror to various different forms of mythology, storytelling, meta-narratives and whatnot. Very, very, very interesting stuff indeed. But for the purposes of this episode, one of the things that really, it's something that I was looking at this morning, which is there's a lot of scuttlebutt at the moment about the up-and-coming cinema adaptation of Lovecraft's The Colour Out of Space, which stars Nicolas Cage. Now, it's a really weird one for me. Lovecraft, for all of his iconic status, for all of his influence on horror, as we've talked about before, there are very, very, very few specific adaptations of Lovecraft out there. And even those that exist are not necessarily verbatim or even that close to the original texts. I always think of The Reanimator, for example. Now, The Reanimator is technically an adaptation of the Lovecraft story Herbert West Reanimator, but it's, tonally speaking, barring the incidents of the subject matter of a student of death and of anatomy learning to somehow resurrect dead bodies, barring that, that's where the similarities between the original story and the film end. It's where they begin and end, quite frankly. I love the film very much, actually. I really like Reanimator. But tonally speaking, it's far closer to the likes of The Evil Dead or something like that, rather The Evil Dead 2 than the original story. The original short story is a full-on work of morbid, macabre horror. Just as it was Lovecraft's penchant, he did not inject humour into his stories, but there's a lot of humour in the Reanimator adaptation, much to its benefit, actually. I think it's a very, very fun film indeed. But one of the reasons why there are very rarely direct adaptations of Lovecraft stories is because they are notoriously difficult to realise. Visually speaking, they tend to be simultaneously very visual and yet very difficult to capture visually. Lovecraft describes phenomena and entities and forces that are, by their very nature, beyond visualization. That's what he was reaching for very often. He describes things like non-Euclidean geometries and planes of existence that don't conform to standard dimensions and entities that defy like preconceptions of anatomy, because he's reaching for the kind of image or the kind of experience that can drive a human being mad just by exposure to it. That's what he's going for. It's this vast cosmological horror. It's disturbia more than anything that he's reaching for. He's looking at the stuff that is designed to warp and twist perception, to alter the state of the observer's mind. Now, obviously, if it's beyond description, by its very nature, it's also beyond visualization. And by capturing and defining the entities or phenomena, they are necessarily limited and made finite, and thereby lose some of their capacity to distress or disturb. They are made into definite articles. It's often a problem when you get, certainly for horror, often for science fiction and fantasy as well, when you get a cinematic adaptation, or a video game adaptation for that matter. There are far more video game adaptations of Lovecraft's work than there are cinematic ones, and many of them are very good. Video games are quite good as a medium at capturing the sense of incipient insanity, and since they are often first person, they allow for a degree of audience engagement and immersion that is necessary to this kind of fiction. You have an investment in them in a way that you don't in a film, which is a passive medium. The problem that a lot of the video games have is exactly the problem I just described. They try to capture and to portray things that are not designed to be portrayed, are not intended to be portrayed. Things like, for example, the most iconic Lovecraft creature, Cthulhu. Cthulhu. Cthulhu is not designed or intended to be portrayed literally. That's the thing. Nothing in Lovecraft is. Certainly none of the great gods or entities or old ones. They are not designed to be portrayed literally. That's why he made them so vast and elaborate, and why the descriptions of them are so florid. Even though the descriptions of Cthulhu are quite specific in the stories, what he describes is only what the human mind and finite perceptions can comprehend. That's sort of the point of the image. It's as close as human preconceptions and human imaginations can come to imagining the entity. The big sort of octopoid-headed behemoth that is so iconic now that you can get plushies of, for God's sake, is not the entity itself. That's just an image or a projection or the merest part of the entity itself, because Cthulhu, like all of the great ones, operates on a level of reality that's just beyond human comprehension. So it's often a mistake to portray him literally. Certainly it would be in a film, and it is in video games, and he does turn up in a couple of the video games, like Dark Corners of the Earth, for example. It's as much as I love that game, it's a mistake to portray him. Things like, for example, Azathoth. Azathoth you could not possibly portray outside of the most delirious, surreal imagery. It would be impossible. It would be absolutely impossible. There are a couple that are more defined, that are easier to portray. Things like characters like Dagon, for example. You could probably do Dagon with relative fidelity and make it work, because he's one of the more defined entities in Lovecraft anyway. But beyond that, no, it's a mistake, and therefore adapting Lovecraft directly becomes a real problem for filmmakers, obviously, because you can't have a situation where the monsters, the creatures, the entities, or the phenomena are directly on screen. You need to capture them in this very impressionistic way. It requires finesse, it requires a degree of comprehension of how the grammar of cinema works. You need to understand Impressionism, you need to understand Surrealism in order to capture Lovecraft. Now, The Colour Out of Space, I would say, is one of the most difficult to adapt, simply because the eponymous phenomena, the colour, the actual phenomena, is by its very nature one of these things that Lovecraft attempts to describe but is beyond description. It's actually a colour. It starts off as a colour. It looks like... it doesn't look like anything that can be described. It is actually a colour that exists outside of the known spectrum. So, first of all, you can't portray that. It's just impossible. At that base element, it's not just that. It's actually a kind of corrupting and twisting and warping force that seeps into the earth and into the ground and into environments and wildlife and ecosystems, and starts to malform them, starts to pollute them, starts to change them into... It's almost like a terraforming influence. And you never... In the original story, you never quite find out what it is. It comes from a meteorite, and it spreads like a disease, and it distorts and corrupts anything it touches. You never really find out what it is, other than it sort of exhibits this bizarre colour that is nothing that can be described. So try to imagine that for 1 second. Try to imagine a colour that you can't describe in terms of other colours, yeah? So purple is kind of like blue and kind of like red, yeah? Orange is kind of like yellow and kind of like red. Pink is kind of like red and kind of like white, yeah? Imagine a colour that's entirely beyond that spectrum. I mean, just to observe that for human beings would be maddening. It would be insane. Even trying to conceive it gives you a headache, yeah? Because you can't. It's actually impossible to imagine what that would look like. Every colour you can imagine is derived from your experience of colour. So no matter what you try to mix or commingle, it's going to be a kind of brown or a kind of blue or a kind of yellow or somewhere in between those. The Colour Out of Space is none of them. It operates on a spectrum that's entirely beyond what the human eye can perceive and what the human imagination can conceive of, which of course just cannot be portrayed on film. And that makes adapting that story next to impossible. it makes it bloody difficult anyway. It's a challenge for a decent filmmaker to do this. What they're going to have to do, I sincerely hope they don't try to portray the actual phenomena. I sincerely hope they don't, because if they do, that's it, that's the end. You can't do it. You actually cannot portray it. It's impossible. So, what I sincerely hope they do, is portray it in terms of human beings' reactions to it. That seems to be the only way they can. So they're going to have to rely upon their actors to carry this. They can hint, they can suggest, they can use lots of different impressionistic and surreal techniques to suggest what this thing is. But if they come to a point where they're trying to portray the colour itself, that's the end. That's that the whole project will fall down on that basis, because it's impossible. It's absolutely, totally impossible. And that's what Lovecraft was going for. That's absolutely intentional on Lovecraft's part. He did not want people to portray his entities. He was very aware of the fact that to portray something is to impose definition upon it, and therefore limitation. It's the same problem, interestingly, that I have with divinities. Certainly divinities that are described as absolute or perfect or divine in any particular way, to be perfectly honest. The moment you apply parameter to something, it is not perfect. That's the end of it. And every deity in all of human mythology, religion, fantasy, in human conception and history, has parameters applied to it and definition. Every single one of them, even those that proclaim otherwise, like Yahweh or El or whatever you want to call him, the big daddy god of the Abrahamic traditions, has lots of parameters applied to him, and therefore is not what it is advertised as. It's a problem for me, and it's the same problem you get here. I don't understand how this can be done except from a sort of experiential perspective, so from the perspectives of the characters. So you don't see the colour, you don't see the phenomena, you could see its effects, you could see like the warping effects that it has on the landscape and on plant life and animal life, but not the colour itself. You could also perhaps see the effects it has upon those that witness it, that see it. That would work. That would work okay. But to actually see the colour itself, well, you can't. As I say, you can't. There's nothing you can do to actually portray that colour. Or that phenomena. It is actually one of Lovecraft's conceptions that is genuinely beyond the ability to portray. Because by its very conception, it defies our sensory apparatus and our imaginations. It totally defies them. It's quite clever in that regard. In fact, it's quite brilliantly clever. It's something that doesn't crop up very often in fiction or literature. In fact, Terry Pratchett does a wonderful lampoon of the very concept in The Colour of Magic, which is partially informed by this very story. There is The Colour of Magic it's a fantasy story that describes exactly what it says on the tin. In the Discworld, when magic is performed, there is a colour which occurs, which is octarine. Octarine being the colour of magic, and 8 being the sacred number of magic in the Discworld. Octarine, and it's a joke. It's an elaborate joke in the Discworld. It's described by the characters that see it as a kind of purpley green, or as a kind of greeny purple, depending on various factors. And of course, those are two they're just absolutely opposed colours. You can't imagine what that would look like commingled. It's insane. You actually can't portray it. And that's again what Pratchett was trying to do. The colour of magic is something that cannot be rendered, that's something that cannot be portrayed or imagined. That's the point. So this is going to be a fascinating experiment. It's either going to be wank, it's going to be simplified and derivative, and it's going to rely upon the name of Lovecraft rather than the ethos and influence of Lovecraft to get itself by. Or it's going to be a very interesting experiment indeed. The thing about films that are Lovecraftian, there are plenty of those. It's just that they're not necessarily of Lovecraft himself. They're not adaptations of Lovecraft's own stories. Things like In the Mouth of Madness. In the Mouth of Madness, which is one of John Carpenter's less well-known and less well-regarded stories. That baffles me. It really does. I love In the Mouth of Madness. In the Mouth of Madness is as close to Lovecraftian as you can possibly get without it being a Lovecraft adaptation in cinema. It does have this slightly gallows humour about it at times, which is not very Lovecraftian, but it also has all of the imagery, all of the metaphysics, and all of the nihilism of a Lovecraft story. The notion that you can be driven mad by something forbidden, like forbidden knowledge and forbidden stories, yep, that's there. Otherworldly, extra-dimensional entities that want to force their way into our world that are anatomically and psychologically beyond conception, yep, they're all there. An entirely hopeless anti-human metaphysics, yep, that's all there. The warping and breaking of reality by forbidden pursuits and forbidden knowledge, yep, that's all there. It's a Lovecraft story. It's Carpenter's love letter to Lovecraft, and it's very good. It's actually very good. It's but not very well regarded. It's unusual. It's slightly odd. The Thing is a Lovecraftian story. It's a very Lovecraftian story, actually. Jacob's Ladder, very, 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 very Lovecraftian. Alien. Alien has shades of Giger in it, as I will be discussing with a friend of mine later on today, actually, for this very podcast. Alien is, because of its influence from Giger, because Giger is was the lead designer on the original film and therefore conceived the original Alien and the facehugger and whatnot, Giger has been overt about his influence from Lovecraft. A lot of his work, a lot of his imagination is inspired by Lovecraft, to the point whereby, of course, one of his most iconic books of paintings is called the Necronomicon, which is the Book of the Dead from Lovecraft stories, the book, the reading of which can drive human beings mad because it contains forbidden knowledge and knowledge of otherworldly things and whatnot. I mean, I suppose in that regard, The Evil Dead does have a tinge of Lovecraft about it. Not much in terms of tone, but definitely in terms of subject. But yeah, how this is going to work, I just do not know. I do not know. Of course, it's also going to be a modernised version or a post-modernised version of the story, because like lots of Lovecraft stories, it is not set in any kind of present day or era. So it's going to have to be adapted to a certain degree. It is going to have to be changed. The story is going to have to be embellished. I just hope they don't do what they do with a lot of horror films, a lot of horror adaptations, where they just stick on the tried and tested, the by-the-numbers horror elements. So they stick in like a love story, they stick in some hideous domestic element. It just doesn't. It isn't necessary. It isn't necessary. It's going to be fascinating. I reserve judgment for now, because it all depends on lots of factors with regards to how the filmmakers preconceive what they're doing. If they have any respect for what Lovecraft was trying to do and any ambition, then they're going to look at the core phenomena of the colour itself, and they're going to regard it as a puzzle to solve and as a problem to explore, and as potentially something that's never really been explored in horror cinema before, because it really hasn't, not to this degree and not with any degree of fidelity. It's very hard because it's something they're going to have to visually skirt around. In terms of how it's portrayed in the film, they're going to have to skirt around it rather than addressing it directly. Any attempt to address it directly will fail and will murder the film. It will totally murder the film. So let's see how it goes, shall we? Let's see how that one goes. Until next time, ladies and gents, bye-bye!